Great. So welcome everybody to the European Homefront during World War II. This will be a conversation between authors Annette Binder and Sandell Morse. My name is Laura Horwood-Benton, and I'm the Public Programming and Community Relations Librarian at Portsmouth Public Library in New Hampshire. Before we get started, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. The city of Portsmouth is on the homelands of the Abenaki people who have ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this area. According to tribal oral tradition, Abenaki people have lived in the place now called New Hampshire for more than 12,000 years, since before tribal memory. The Abenaki are part of a larger group of indigenous people who call themselves Wabanaki, or People of the Dawn, and form one of many communities connected by a common language family. Here at the Portsmouth Public Library, we are committed to acknowledging and honoring the human history tied to this land. So this event tonight will last until between 8 and 8:15 p.m., and we plan to be respectful of your time. If you have questions about library services or programs at Portsmouth Public Library, feel free to ask me at the end. We are recording this event and we'll be putting it up on the library's YouTube page in the next few days. So we ask everyone today to keep themselves muted until the end when we'll have a little time for Q&A, and then you're welcome to unmute yourself as long as you're comfortable being recorded during that portion. If you're not, you're also free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that our authors see them. We love hearing from you about what you'd like to see at the library, and I'm going to share a link to our online event feedback form in the chat. You can fill it out and you'll not only help us at the library, but you'll also be entered to win a library book bag, and we do a drawing once a month. I will also share a link to sign up for our monthly email newsletter if you're not already on the list. I'd like to thank River Run Bookstore for partnering with us this evening. They're making both of our authors' books available for purchase online with a 20% discount. Please support your local bookstore, especially during these difficult times. So I will share those links in the chat, as well as links to both authors' websites too. So now I'm pleased to welcome Annette Binder and Sandell Morse. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. So Annette and I, for our events, usually alternate. And so I'm going first tonight. And I want to thank you, Laura, very, very much for scheduling us for tonight. It's very exciting. I live in Portsmouth. I returned here just this past fall after living in York for a number of years. And I lived in Portsmouth a long, long time ago. And it actually feels wonderful to be back. This book, The Spiral Shell, is my debut memoir at age 81. But I haven't been idle before that. I've published for years and years in literary magazines. And truthfully, I thought, well, that's enough. Although I have written much longer manuscripts. I've written novels. I've written another memoir. But I had no idea how much difference having a book would make in my life. And at this moment, it's a very exciting thing. And it all began in 2011 when I was awarded a residency in Vichy France. It's a village in the southwest, and the residency is called Moulin à Neuf, and it's owned and operated by the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, where I'd been a fellow for many, many years. I became interested in the village's history, particularly during the Second World War. And I began kind of researching and nosing around. And the more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And one of the first things I did learn was that there had been a young boy in the village during the war whose name was Jean Hirsch. He was a 9-year-old resistance courier whose parents were active in the resistance. And so my maiden name is Hirsch, or Hirsch in French. And so I just felt this visceral kind of connection. I wasn't searching for my roots, and he's not related to me, but I just needed to know more. And I went back to that village for about 8 years. I stayed in France. I would visit for about a month each time. I traveled to many, many different places. And I'm going to, before I read, I have a couple of brief readings, but I'm going to share my screen with you and give you a little background about France, the villages, and the subject matter of this book. So this is a map of France. And when I arrived, I would generally fly into Paris, and then I would take another plane to, yes, to where? To, oh, to Toulouse, way down here. And this gives you an idea of the wartime when folks left Paris to flee to the south, and they had quite a distance to travel. So I would fly in, and I would come into Toulouse, and then I would be met by someone and drive about an hour to Auvillard, which is about here. This village that's in red is Bouillon, and it's about a 2-hour drive from Auvillard. And in my research, I learned that there was a secret house in Bouillon that protected Jewish refugee children. And I met a woman who actually was a caretaker in this house during the war. She was 92 when we met, and she died this past a year ago, February, at 101. And so she was from Paris. And I learned that Jews basically did not live in the small villages. They were urban, and they fled to these villages for safety. And unfortunately, it's a similar situation to today, where those who survived were usually people of means, and people surviving this pandemic are often people of means. And this is the clock tower in the village of Auvillard, where I stayed. And it's a medieval village. And during medieval times, this village was gated. It had 3 gated entrances. And this building that you can see just not too well, but it does have a turquoise shutter, is a place that will play out in the book and in the story. And there's a soap shop here. And my next slide is a picture that I came across. This is a poster in a window of a house that was vacant at the time. And when I saw this poster, I really didn't understand what was going on, because it was a replica of a wartime identity card. And this large red J identified these people as Jews, and they were a family. And the post, I have another one that's closer up, but I did want to show you that J. So here is the family, and this is Bruno Kurzweil, his wife, Gazelle, and their daughter, Adele. And she is 17. And what this poster is telling me is that in 2012, there was a commemoration of this family in this village. I knew nothing about them, but I knew who to ask. And that was Gerhard Schneider, who retired to the village. He's a philosopher, and he's also a student of religion. He's Catholic. He's married to a Catholic French woman. And he was very, very interested in this story and in Jewish history. And so I did go and talk to him about this. This is that shop I showed you, La Savonnerie, and this is where the family lived, in rooms above. But you will not learn that from the villagers. And there was a great deal of secrecy, both during the war and after the war, as to this history. Gerhard, for that commemoration, wanted to have plaques put on this building to remember the family. And he could not get permission to do that from the town council. And I thought to myself, well, what about a Stolperstein? That's going to be in something that I read to you, and I want to explain to you what that is. A Stolperstein is a brass paving stone that was created by a German artist to mark the places where Jews had lived and were taken away by the Nazis. And my final slide for the moment is a picture of from Adele's diary. The family was deported, but their possessions survived. They were found more than 50 years later, locked in a room of the town hall. And this page from her journal talks about this being her last day in Montauban because she was going with her parents to the beautiful village of Auvillard. Adele wanted to be a designer, and this is an example of one of her dresses. These are her books. It's a very strange museum because it's really a room in a recreation center. And I was the only one visiting, and I don't think it got many visitors at all. And I thought to myself while I was there, I could take that page. I could take a book and nobody would know. And that struck me. So I am going to stop sharing screen, and I'm going to read a bit about this for you. Let's see. So I spent a lot of time talking with Gerhard. And so I'm going to read to you from that moment when I learned about the family and when I left Gerhard's house in the village and I went down to take a look at that soap shop. Standing outside La Savonnerie, I took in the facade with its wide French doors and sash, painted the same turquoise as the shutters. With the shutters opened and fastened to the outside of the building, there was no room for a plaque. Why not a Stolperstein? But Auvillard did not want to stumble over its past. I thought about Adele, a teenager, as my two older granddaughters were teenagers. Adele, living in the flat above. Adele, a child of war. My granddaughters, children of relative peace and relative prosperity. Walking to school, laughing with friends, selfish in the way of teenage girls. My granddaughters did not glance back into time. Who would lead them there? Perhaps they would have to stumble on their own to learn the moral dilemmas of the Shoah are ongoing. I stood outside the Tabac and imagined Adele spinning a rack with postcards. Every day the cards were the same. Still she spun, as if seeing this village for the first time. The Church of St. Peter, golden in sunlight, the stone pillars and red-tiled roof of the round market, the ancient chapel of St. Catherine in the old port. Adele spoke perfect, unaccented French, and she wrote in French. She could have passed, but really, in those days, could anyone pass? How long did she have? 2 weeks? 3 weeks? Inside the Tabac, Adele handed her postcards to the proprietor. Later, in her family's rooms above the soap shop, she would write to Hannah Pampanak, her old school friend, who had emigrated to the States. As the proprietor slipped Adele's postcard into a paper bag, the proprietor's daughter, sitting on a stool behind the counter, stared in that uncompromising way of children. And that was why, years and years later, she would remember and say to Gerhard, she used to come to my mother's shop. She bought postcards. She had beautiful hair. Late that afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the hills and trees, I carried a glass of wine to a picnic table beside the Garonne. Time circled. and light faded like a blue night note wailing. I watched the river's smooth surface and understood that beneath that placid exterior, a strong current pulled. Adele used to come here. She might have even sketched here. Adele had dreamed of designing women's fashions. I'd seen her drawings wrapped in protective tissue. When Pascal Kaya unpacked the family suitcases, a woman in profile wearing a black gown, two girls wearing shorts and tight-fitting tops. In her own hand, Adele had captioned this drawing in English, "Hip hip, hooray." On the Kurzweil's family's last night, Bruno Kurzweil sat at a table composing a letter to a friend. He wrote, "I am anxious about my family. I feel problems coming." Perhaps Adele lay awake in her bed. Perhaps she padded into the parlor and looked over her father's shoulder before he covered his writing with his palm or a bladder. Perhaps they heard it at the same time, the sound of a motor coming closer. Downstairs in front of the soap shop, gendarmes herded Bruno, Gazelle, and Adele Kurzweil up into the back of an open truck, the kind of truck a farmer would use to transport animals. Were the other three families already inside? Were the Kurzweils the first, the second, the last? Each person carried a small bundle, all that was allowed. The Kurzweil suitcases, packed so carefully for travel, stayed behind. In addition to the Kurzweils, the families were Regina and Manfred Martz, Lieselot and Bernard Roth, Sigismund and Anna Weinwitz, Ernst Weisselberg, and a son whose name is missing. There were 5 families, not 4. As dawn streaked its colors above the horizon and farmers made their way to barns and fields, the truck motored past, and I wondered if anyone had turned to look or maybe refused to. 7 months earlier at the Wannsee conference in a suburb of Berlin, the Third Reich had ordered implementation of the final solution, murder of all Jews. The families from Auvillard were taken to Septfonds, an internment camp outside of Montauban, then to Drancy. Bruno, Gazelle, and Adele Kurzweil joined convoy number 30, and on arrival at Auschwitz, all 3 were gassed. Farther later on in that chapter, and in the paragraph that ends the chapter, which is on a much better note, I am back on a bench at the river, and I'm thinking Adele had sat here, not on this bench, not at this table, but here at the river. She breathed, she lived, she dreamed. She hoped and she sketched. Auvillard buried her story, and years later, Gerhard found it and hoisted it up into the light of an August day of commemoration. I imagined Gerhard and Mary Jo leading the villagers from the chapel. They approached the blue suspension bridge and walked along the narrow sidewalk. At the railing, Gerhard lifted an arm as if to give the downbeat. The villagers dropped roses to the river below, long-stemmed pink and red roses, fragrant, fragile roses drifting down, then floating. The river swallowed them. Life was like that, fragile, beautiful, and brutal. The villagers did not see her, but she was there, Adele floating above them, wind sweeping her beautiful hair.
Sandell, that is just a haunting and beautiful part of your memoir. And I was wondering, during this chapter, your friend Gerhard explains to you that nobody knew memory changes. And in thinking about it, you wrote, perhaps he means memory shifts or disappears. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit about what you think Gerhard meant when he said memory changes, and how these objects, these forgotten, treasured objects that this family packed so carefully, sort of is a rebuke to that sort of forgetfulness, and sort of prompts us to remember it in this very unexpected way so many decades later.
Thank you for that question. I think what Gerhard meant was that there were two things happening all over Europe, in the United States, all over. It happens today. That memory changes because people create different memories, and they truly believe them, and everyone remembers differently. And sometimes I think Gerhard, he's like 2 years younger than I am. He has vivid memories of the war in Germany, and his family's home was bombed, and they went out twice. And after the second time, they went to live with his mother's family in the countryside. And so he would tell me that it was very painful to remember, and he didn't want to remember. And he said he didn't like learning about the history in school either, because he said it's very hard to think of yourself as a bad person or your country as a bad country. And so I think that's what he meant by memory shifts. And for him, the digging down and the uncovering was extremely necessary for him to face what was the truth of his history. I think it was very, very brave. And the second part of your question, Annette.
Oh, that was really the heart of the question, Sandell.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I know that when you read it, we have very similar stories in the way that your characters and my people deal with memory, and also there's a great silence about it. And that chapter at the end where I read about the woman and the little girl in the soap shop, when Gerhard found out about this history on an Austrian website. He didn't find out about it in Ovilar. And when he started asking questions in the village, he said nobody remembered anything. Nobody knew anything until finally this woman came up to him, and this old woman was the little girl in her mother's shop. I know what your question was. It was about the details. It was about what is left behind. And I think that what happened to me when writing this book was that the fact that those things still existed made the lives more alive and made the deaths more of a loss. And I'm going to switch now and talk to you a little bit about Germain Poliakov. And I'm going to show you a few more slides just because it's more interesting. And let's see, where did they go? Here we go. Okay, so this is the secret house in Bouillon-sur-Dordogne. It sits square in the middle of the village in a tiny square. And when I went to the village and I interviewed the local historian and he asked me if I wanted to see this house, I thought we were going to get in his car and drive out into the countryside. But no, we took a little walk from the tourist office to this house in this little square. And what I find most interesting about this house is its location. And in the foreground, which you can't see, there is a statue of the Virgin and Child. And over it's my right, over past here, there is the huge Abbey of St. Peter. And in the foreground, on another side of the square, is a restaurant. And the restaurant was owned by the Laquez family, and they were Catholic resistors. And they owned not only the restaurant, they owned this house. And they knowingly rented it to the Jewish Scouts. And the Jewish Scouts were a normal scouting organization before the war. And during the war, they turned all of their organizational expertise to saving Jewish children. And this is where Germaine was one of the caretakers. And here is Germaine during the war inside the house with her best friend Sultan. And Sultan was her nom de guerre, and Germaine's nom de guerre was Maki. And this is a radio with an antenna, totally illegal. And the girls would listen to French free radio, and the director of the house would whisper to them, "Girls, turn it down." It was dangerous. And Germaine, this is Germaine's oldest son. The house closed in 1943 when the German army officially invaded the South. And the family stayed in the village. Germaine's husband was a resistance fighter. And so this is Daniel at 3 years old. And I would say that's probably around 1944. And he's holding on to a railing and standing on steps. And this is Daniel in more recent years. He went back and held on to what looks like a different railing, but sat on the same steps. This is Germaine the last time I saw her, which was October of 2019. And I feel so fortunate that I was able to bring her and hand her an ARC, which was an advance reader's copy of the book. And I didn't want to sign it. She said, "You must sign it." And I said, "No, I want to sign the real book when it comes out." And she said, "No, you must sign this." And she was absolutely right, because she died the following February at 101. Now I'm going to read a little bit about from the Paris story. And this is quite a short reading. So I would always go visit Germaine in her flat in a suburb of Paris, and we would always eat and we would always drink wine, and she would always bake her signature tart. I will never forget the first time I met her, watching her carry a tray with a pot of hot water and cups and tea from the kitchen. She left her cane behind because she couldn't manage the cane and the whole tray. She was amazing. So this is the first time that I meet Daniel, however, and this is later in the story, and we're talking about post-war Paris. But this is the adult Daniel. Daniel wore jeans, a navy blue pullover sweater with 2 gray stripes at the chest and 3 buttons, and a collar that was askew. He was nearly bald and so handsome with his crystalline blue eyes that I immediately remembered a story Germaine had told. One day in Bouillon, when Daniel was 3, 2 Nazi soldiers approached on the sidewalk. Germaine held tight to Daniel's hand, and as the soldiers passed, she overheard one say to the other, "Oh, they make such beautiful little Aryans here in France." I remembered an archival photograph of another boy, about 3. This boy had dark, sad eyes. He raised his hands in surrender, pinned to the lapel of his tiny jacket a yellow cloth Star of David. And in my imagination, I saw them side by side, the supposed Aryan child and the unnamed Jewish child. One would live, one would die. At the end of that paragraph and at the end of our visit, we were all around the table, and a spirited exchange erupted at the table. Earlier, we talked of Germaine's bicycle, the one she rode through post-war Paris, pedaling the children to school. Germaine remembered 2 baskets, one draped over the handlebars and one attached to the back fender. No, Daniel said, only one basket on the front for Arlette. Yes, of course there was a basket for Aline, Germaine said. No basket, Daniel said. Aline rode on the seat. And you? Germaine asked. I rode on the back. Daniel recalled the steep hill and his mother speeding down without brakes. He touched his index finger to his temple. She was crazy. We all laughed because we loved Germaine's craziness. We loved Germaine. And this is what united us all, love crossing cultures and crossing a sea. As for the second basket, I believed Daniel. And it was as if I were seeing them all, Daniel, Aline, Arlette, and Germaine, holding tight and speeding into their day. We need many voices to tell our stories, for the truth lies not in each voice, but in the context of our blended notes. I, too, the storyteller, imagined my version of Germaine on her bicycle, placing her in the warmth of a spring day, pedaling the rutted streets and dodging piles of rubble. Somewhere in the midst of our different stories, we find our common humanity. So thank you. And Annette, that last bit, I didn't realize it, speaks to the question that you just asked me before about memory.
It does, you're right.
Yep, yep. And it's about, I think, what so many lack today, and that is the ability to hold many contradictions in your hand and figure out what's what from that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's right. I think it's also a sort of testimony to the resilience of family and of motherhood in times of great trauma and difficulty. Sandell.
Yes, I agree. Yes, Germaine was the one who not only cared for other children, but cared for her own children. And I don't want to give too much away, but she had a really hard time with her husband during the war. And she was the resilient one. And it is a huge testament to motherhood and the strength of women, which, of course, is what your book is truly about as well.
That is true. I have, for some reason, the British copy, which is a different cover, but I'll show it anyway. Yes, this is my first novel, which has a completely different cover in the UK. I had previously published a collection of short stories.
Here's the.
Yes, I'm like, what am I doing with this one?
The cover you look for.
Yeah, so look how different they are. I mean, I like them, but they have such a different feel, the two of them. The US copy has a picture of the city of Würzburg, which is where my family is from and where much of the novel happens after it's been destroyed by the Allied bombing of mid-March. Actually, it's just a month away from, I guess it will be the 76th anniversary of that bombing that really leveled the city. And it is the story of a mother named Etta Huber, who's trying to hold her family together in a small town in under Franconia in Germany during the final 6 months of the war. Etta's older son, Max, has come home from the Eastern Front, suffering from a mental breakdown. And as his condition deteriorates, she knows she's going to have to hide him from the authorities because otherwise they'll take him from her. And at the same time, her younger son, Georg, who's only 15 and in the Hitler Youth, which was at that point compulsory for almost all boys in Germany, he knows he's not really fit to be a soldier. He doesn't live up to any of the ideals of this terrible regime. And so he, when he sees his chance, jumps from a truck and runs away and tries to make his way back home to his mother, which is really just where he wants to be. And the novel interweaves those two stories until they come together. Like Sandell, I thought I'd share some images just to give you all a little bit of background for the story. So much of the story happens in a very small town named Markteidenfeld, which is on the Main River in Lower Franconia, which is part of Bavaria. Although my mother would always say, well, our taxes go to Bavaria, but we're not really Bavarian. We're Franconian. We're under Franconian. For those of you in New Hampshire, the feel of Markteidenfeld is very similar to the Upper Valley, which is where I live now, in terms of its climate and its trees and the river, everything. It's very similar. And my mother, who is here now, has said more than once that she thinks it's very strange that she ended up in the same place that she started, most unexpectedly. My parents were from the towns of Zimmern and Rodenfels, which are the sort of smaller towns near Markteidenfeld, just across the river from each other. And all of these towns are very close to the city of Würzburg, which is a very old historic city in Germany. It actually predates Roman times. It's known for its beautiful half-timbered architecture, and it's the site of a very renowned university in Germany. And at this university, during World War II, the University Psychiatric Clinic was also the site of the systematic murder of people with mental illness and other neurological conditions. And the scope of the program and the numbers of people suffering from these diseases who were murdered there only came to light relatively recently. The city of Würzburg was largely destroyed by the Allied firebombing by the British, the Royal Air Force, in mid-March 1945. Between 4,000 and 5,000 people lost their lives. Many thousands more were left homeless. And one of my mother's earliest memories is actually of her father coming home from an earlier bombing in the city of Würzburg with his winter coat bloodied and torn. She would have only been about 5 at that time, but she remembers it vividly. So I had started writing this novel, and if someone had told me that I would write a story set in Germany, I would have just shaken my head, because I came to the US as a small kid. I was about 5.5, and the minute I came, the minute my feet hit the ground here, I started speaking English, and my parents would speak German to me, and I'd answer in English, much in particular to my mother's chagrin. And yet, when I started writing a long piece of fiction, the mother character, Etta, came to me first, and I was about 2 chapters in, and I decided to snoop around a little bit and find out a little bit more about my family, since my father had never told me anything about his childhood, and he had passed away when I was 16. I was a little bit curious, and so I found a family photo album that showed pictures of my father. He would have been 7 here, because he was born in 1930, and he's standing on the school steps. And I thought to myself, what a cute kid he was. He looked very rambunctious, a little troublemaking. And then the last picture in his childhood album was of him wearing his Hitler Youth uniform. And I recognized it because of the pin that he's wearing, which has the Nazi insignia. He would have been 13 or probably 14 here. And it was really, apart from just a shock of seeing him in the Hitler Youth uniform, it was really the expression in his eyes that stayed with me and really haunted me, because there's that sadness in his eyes that I see here as a boy that he carried his entire life, my entire childhood. He had that sort of sorrowful expression. And so this photograph actually was the inspiration in many ways for the younger character Georg in my novel. And though Georg Huber took on his own life and was completely different from Annette Binder, I kept this photograph on my desk as I wrote, because it was a reminder of that whole generation of German boys who were raised, they were indoctrinated, they were raised on this idea that to be a hero, they had to sort of conform to the murderous regime's ideology. A couple of other things. Well, here's my father just a few years later when he was 20, and my parents as newlyweds. My mother really became the source for many of the stories, since I'd never asked my father what I should have when I had the chance. I really treasure the fact that I was able to spend hours with my mother learning about life in Germany, learning about what my father had told her about his experience in the Hitler Youth, how he had tried to run away from his post in the Hitler Youth. In many ways, that was the inspiration, how his older brother was able to live up to their father's ideals and expectations in a way that my father wasn't. So many of these things found their ways, sometimes obliquely, into the book. A couple of other things that I found that really stayed with me and helped me imagine what it might have been like to live under this regime were the racial purity notebook that my father was required to complete. It has tabs for your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, going back generation after generation. And what you had to do was you had to go either to the town or to the church and document that there was no Jewish ancestry. And this was absolutely chilling. My father documented his family background to 1819. So, 120 years earlier. But it was just chilling to me to see this just in my hand and to realize that people had to do this. And if they didn't, or if it revealed something, that they would face horrible consequences. The idea that paper really governed what happened to a person. Paper could end up resulting in your death, or it could set you free, was something that I carried with me as I wrote. And another thing that I found that was very odd was his cursive notebook from when he would have been 9, almost 10, and on how the regime sort of worked its way into everything, no matter how trivial. So to learn the letter G, one of the things they had to write again and again was Goebbels, 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 Göring, Göring, Göring. It just worked its way into every aspect of life. And again, what really stayed with me, though, was my father's expression. And that was one of the things, of the many regrets that I have, not asking him about what his life was like is certainly high on the list. So I'm going to read just a couple of very short pieces. This one is sort of toward maybe a third of the way through the book, and Etta, the mother in the Huber family, has just visited a dear friend of hers named Ilse. And Ilse has taken Etta down to the cellar and shown her all of these very precious objects that Ilse is taking care of for the Jewish families in Marktheidenfeld who'd had to leave just a few years earlier. And even though they both know that the families aren't coming back, Ilse says, when they come back, they'll thank me. Ilse nodded as she spoke. They'll thank me for taking good care of their things. And even as she said it, they both knew it wasn't true. Maybe it was the liquor, or maybe the coming rain. The roads looked narrower than usual when Etta walked home. The wind bit through her scarf. She thought of those dolls and their patent shoes and all that fine silver, and the clocks ticking in the cellar, and Ilse keeping watch, just Ilse and her whiskey jars. How hard to be in that house, alone with all those things. The air must be thick with ghosts. How little she knew about Ilse. More than 40 years together and church every week. They drank their coffee and birthed their babies and knelt together at their family graves, and they were mysteries one to the other. Etta stopped once by the bridge and wound her scarf across her mouth. People were inside already. They were drawing their curtains and snuffing out their lights. They huddled close to their wood-burning stoves, which sent up smoke into the sky, gray on gray. People were born in Heidenfeld and buried there, and their children too, and their children's children. They lived in the same houses, one generation after the next, and went to the same schoolhouse and worshipped at the same churches. The buildings outlasted them all, and still people went away. They went away sometimes, carrying only a satchel or a trunk. She'd seen it herself. The Weinsteins and the Singas and the Sterns who left behind their things. The two sisters who were prone to twitches and to fits. Twins who dressed alike and worked side by side for Frau Ebing, the seamstress. And they climbed aboard the train one morning and never came back. Young Hillen with his baby face was gone, and the gypsies went somewhere too. They were gone from one day to the next, and there were no more bonfires by the riverbank then, and no more dancing. How easy it was to forget them. Things changed, and the mind adjusted, and it was an act of will to remember anything at all.
So thank you, Annette. That is so beautiful. And that line, it is an act of will to remember anything at all. And I think of Ilse keeping all of those amazing objects, the possessions of the Jews who were gone. And that is an amazing act of will on her part. It seems to me like there's something driving her to remember. You talk about that?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, Sandell, because I think, writing the book gave me the chance to explore, even within a unit as small as just a family of, at this point, 3, because Georg is away, sort of how different people's reactions are and how denial comes into play more for some people than for others. And so you have Etta's husband, Josef, who is becoming increasingly nationalistic, even as Germany really teeters on the brink of just total defeat. He is feeling more and more compelled to try to defend the country, particularly against the Bolsheviks and the Soviets coming in. And then you have Ilse, who I think grapples with knowledge, and it's knowledge that's suppressed most of the time, but sometimes it comes out. And I think it comes out in different ways. I think being with Ilse and seeing these objects and remembering these families who at this point have been gone for years already, when everything else is happening, and is in such a sort of crisis mode, it's easy to forget these things, and yet they're still there. They're still just under the surface, and it doesn't take much for someone like Etta to remember them and to sort of grapple and to struggle and to realize that something horrible has happened and continues to happen, even within the context of this greater defeat that everyone is about to experience.
I found that sort of a double-edged thing, the idea of the objects, because they truly bring back the people to Etta and to Ilse, and yet, but they wouldn't have known this, but Hitler's objective was to destroy all of the Jews and create a museum to the Jews with their objects, all in a huge museum. And I don't know what to make of that comparison, but it came into my brain that that it is about memory, but it seems to me that was such an odd thing to create a museum to people that you have destroyed.
Yeah, I mean, I think the objects are a rebuke, and I think that really comes in the context of the Adele story too. They're a rebuke. They're a sort of people insisting I was here and I will not be forgotten. I think at some level these objects are a rebuke to all those who would try to forget or try to sort of change what happened, and they come up in unexpected ways, which is why I think your piece about Adele's family is so very powerful, because these objects, so perfectly and lovingly packed, stayed forgotten for 50 years, but they are a rebuke to the town and to everything that happened and to everyone who would try to forget, decade after decade, and they're still there. And it's almost as if they were just waiting to be discovered.
I love that. Thank you. Do you have another reading?
Yes, I thought, it's funny. I think writers really are a bit like magpies, in that we collect little things as we write that inspire us. And so one of the things was a photograph of my father. And then strangely, another object that really inspired me as I wrote was a Walking Lady Liberty $50, an American silver coin, because the younger boy in the Huber family loves magic and he loves coin tricks. And even though he knew he should not have these American coins, that was a risky thing for him to have, they'd been sent to him by his uncle who had immigrated to Wisconsin years before. He cherished these coins because he found them beautiful. And so he continued to practice with them and actually had them with him even after he'd run away from his post. And magic and the idea of disappearing and just wanting to perfect his magic was something that carried him through. It sustained him, and it was a gift given to him by his mother. She'd given him a book, and this book is actually a real book. And strangely enough, magpie-like again, I came across this book. My husband makes knives as a hobby, and I came across this book when he was at a big show in Las Vegas, of all places, buying materials to make knives. And there was someone who had old books, and there was this old German book called Magic Made Easy by a magician and actor, I believe, named Ernst Firnholzer. And I saw this book and I thought, well, I have to have this book. It was from the 30s or 40s. And I knew it was going to play a role in my novel, even though I had no idea how. And so I bought this book, and I can find something to buy anywhere my husband takes me. It really doesn't matter. I can be at a hardware store and find something. And I carried this book around with me for a long time. And then it became clear that this book belonged to the younger Huber boy, to Georg. And so this little bit is how he came across this book from his mother. And he had been sick with a lung infection, and his mother's trying to get him out of bed. And so he's finally strong enough to come down to the kitchen. When he was strong enough to come down to the kitchen for his meals, she brought out a package and set it by his plate. He could tell it was another book. He undid the twine and tore away the paper and let it fall to the kitchen floor. Conjuring Made Easy, the cover promised. A magic book for everyone, by Ernst Firnholzer. There were photos inside, dozens of them, and detailed explanations of every sort of trick, not just the regular ones, but strange ones too, that required silk string and doves, apples and sugar cubes. He pushed his plate aside and thumbed through the pages. It'll take forever to learn all these, he said. The good things take work. She wiped her hands dry on her apron. They're a sharpening stone. She made no sense sometimes, the way she said things, but he was used to it. They all were. They ate and let her talk, and they nodded sometimes to show that they were listening. Yes, they'd say yes, and they'd reach for the ladle or the bread basket. Mutti left him and went out to the garden, and he sat with his book. It must have taken old Firnholzer years to pull the tricks together. Georg went through the pages and imagined the author and just how he was. He was old, Georg could tell from the way he wrote, and he probably lived high on a hill. Moonvine grew in his garden, and primrose and angel's trumpet, and all the flowers opened up at night, because that's when he worked. That's when the coins and the cards moved best beneath his hands. What a sweet life he had, old Firnholzer. What a sweet life to make things vanish. Georg kept the book in his room. He tried the tricks, but he was lazy about it and undisciplined. He left his coins where he had dropped them. Something's wrong with them, he'd say. They're too big, and these ones here are too thin, and they slip between my fingers. He went peevish at the coins and cursed them, and he set the book aside and went back to his stories. When the carnival came in October, Mutti took him, because he loved the games there and the hawkers with their fresh pretzels and their bouncing balls. She gave him a few coins and left him by the gate. He walked tall through the crowd. His legs were shaky from all that time in bed, but still it was good to feel the sun shining on his head. An old man was there that day, stooped low over his accordion, and though Georg wanted to play darts and buy a goldfish in a bowl, there was something in the old man's face that stopped him. His eyes were shut tight, as if he were sleeping in his chair. He played a mournful song, a song that didn't belong at any carnival, and the accordion wailed and quavered and beat like a heart between his palms. The old man was communing with the angels. Georg could see it in his face. A strange power was working its way through him and pulling all the people toward the sound. Georg wondered how it would be to stop people like that, to stop them where they were and make them listen. He left the carnival with the coin still in his pocket. He didn't want goldfish anymore or caramels. He picked up old Fionholz's magic book when he came home and read it from the first page to the last. And when he was done, he read it again. He set aside part of his room as his studio, and Mutti found him a little folding table and a piece of black velvet. She brought him whatever Fionholzer called for, sugar cubes and extra soft pencils and silk thread spun fine as a spider web. She found it all. She let out a sigh when he asked for a bird, but then she gave in and brought him a yellow parakeet. She'd gone 3 towns over to find the bird, and all the people had looked at her when she carried it back on the train. He'd wanted a fat gray dove and not a parakeet, but he was happy all the same, and when he practiced there in his room, with Kaspar whistling and pecking in his cage, time stopped for him and he was content. He took his coins everywhere he went, even to school, and as he walked he held them tight in the fold of his muscle between his thumb and his palm, so tight that he could swing his arms from side to side and wave at old Frau Fada as she swept her stoop, and the coins would not come loose. He'd check the tricks off as he learned them, and each time he'd call Mutti to his room. "Come see," he'd say, "come quick," and she sat in his chair. He'd clear off his table and smooth out the coverlet and rub his hands together to warm them up. He watched Mutti as he worked, to see whether she was looking in the right places. He could tell from her eyes just how the trick had gone. He worked early in the morning, before he left for school, and after dinner, and on weekends too, and all the pages came loose and fell across his floor. The day he left for the Hitler Academy, when his trunk had been packed and she'd walked with him to the station, Mutti set the book in his hands. She'd repaired it with binding tape, page by page, a job that must have taken hours. She'd cupped his face in her hands and gave him a kiss on each cheek, and she was waving still as his train pulled out and rounded the corner.
Annette, thank you. I think one of your greatest gifts as a novelist is the passion, the emotion, and the love that your characters show for one another. And that's not an easy thing to do.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I love the coins. Something that almost came to you accidentally as a writer becomes a motif that it's followed throughout the book. You never quite let it go, and it links the past, the present, and it links your characters, and they play just a huge thematic role in the book. It's wonderful. You all have to read this book. It's really wonderful. Can we open, do you think, for questions?
Absolutely.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. It's the most fun.
Yeah, so please feel free to ask a question. If you'd prefer that your video and audio is not on the recorded video, then feel free to write your question in the chat and I can ask it. Or feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
You know, while we're waiting for questions, I mean, one thing that does come up is these little objects that we sort of, as writers, linger on, that we sort of carry with us. And Sandell, I was wondering if maybe you could explain the origin of the title for your memoir.
Well, the minute you said the beginning of that, I knew where you were going. So yeah, it seems like an odd title, doesn't it, for this book? But it comes from an actual experience I had whenever I went to Paris, I liked to stay in the Marais, which is the old Jewish section, which is now quite nice, quite trendy. But there was a side of the Marais that I had never explored before. And so I took a walking tour, and the guide went up to this, what looked to me like this nondescript building with this big limestone building block. And limestone is what almost all of the buildings in Paris are made of, because Paris, France was once an inland sea, and the limestone is there's a quarry below the city, and all of the limestone still comes from that place. So he was trying to show us something, a little shape, and I couldn't see it, and I didn't know what he was doing. And then he took the group, and they were moving on, and I went up to that block of limestone, and I had to see what he was looking at and what he was tracing with his finger. And it was an imprint of a very, very tiny spiral shell. And so I began, I don't know how it sort of came to me, but once you have that image, then it's planted in your brain. And as a writer, it's going to connect somewhere, and you have no idea where it's going to connect. But that became for me a metaphor about all of the loss, and the loss of the Kurzweil family, the loss in Germain's family, the tremendous loss that all these people wanted to do was to live and to make some sort of an imprint with their lives. And so that was something that was just struck me. And then later on the tour, we were in a garden, and I thought we were on little pebbles. Turns out we were on limestone, and the guide looked down, and then he plucked something, and then he gestured to me, and then he dropped it into my palm, and it was a tiny, tiny spiral shell from the bottom of the sea. And I carried that back with me, and it became almost like, I felt it like it was a talisman, that it was something that was protecting me. And as I walked through customs, I'm always very, very aware of my middle name, Hirsch, which is on my passport. And I think that's a residual thing of all the history that I've absorbed. And I had this little shell in my pocket, and I just felt like, whew, we passed through. And I have it with me today.
Thank you, Sandell. I have one comment here that I just like to read that's not a question. Then there are a few questions. I don't have a question, but I just want more. It is so wonderful to be here and be captivated by really good authors who also read really well, spellbindingly, actually. The sound of a human voice reading aloud is so intimate and so beautiful. Thank you.
No, that's so nice.
Thank you.
That was too nice not to read out loud. So this is a question for Annette. What does your mother think of your book?
You know, my mother was able to read. It took me 8 years to write a first draft. And I actually started writing this book 20 years ago, like right around the year 2000 was when I started. So my mother read a very early first draft and just was so happy and so excited. It was not, she's always been my biggest cheerleader. And in many ways, she is the model for Etta, the mother in this family. And so she's very excited. She's here now. Her memory isn't what it used to be, but she's still very excited and aware that the book is out there, and is just really, really happy about it. I wonder what my dad would have thought. You know, I mean, I really do wonder. He was a man of very few words. And so I think even if he would have been excited or proud, he probably wouldn't have said anything. But I do wonder what he would have thought of the Huba family and sort of just the book being out there in the world.
Another question we had in the chat, this person says, such beautiful readings, thank you both. You both bring the history to life through individuals and through the details of daily life. Can you talk about how you were able to uncover these details?
Sure, Sandell, do you want to go first?
Okay. really by talking to people and to listening to their stories. And I did a lot of research as well. And one of the books that I read was Bloodlands by Timothy Snyder. And he's a Yale historian, and he talks about the Bloodlands, not just Hitler's Bloodlands, but Stalin's Bloodlands. And he talks about the importance of listening or hearing people's voices, and he talks about the notes that people would throw from those rail cars that were transporting the Jews to the camps. And here was a historian, academic, talking about the individual voice. And usually you only hear novelists or memoirists talking about this, but that struck me. And I really feel that that was what I needed to do. I really needed to find the voices, and I needed to tell their stories. Now, Germaine was, her stories came to me over time. She did not reveal everything at once. The first time I met her, she was telling me a story that I felt she had told many, many times over. And it was only after we became closer that she revealed some of her more intimate stories. Of course, with the Kurtz files, there were diaries. I neglected to say that a very good friend of mine introduced me to a woman who lived in Paris, who was a Jewish historian and spoke perfect English. And she became my translator. And so she was invaluable to me. She would translate documents for me, help me with the translation of some of the letters. Gerhard would help me with the translation of some of Adele's writings. And what else? Mostly just talking to people. And I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't set out to do this. I just kept going. I was fortunate that I could keep going. And so I did.
Mm-hmm. I think your point about talking to people is so true. I mean, my mother was really the source for so much of like the daily life, the recipes, how people heated their houses, how they sort of, what it was like, the sort of texture of the daily life. And then for things that my mom couldn't really help me with, like what it was like to be in the Hitler Youth, I really had to find first-person accounts. And there's one book in particular by a writer named Alfons Heck that was just incredibly helpful, talking about his time in the Hitler Youth and how years later he came to terms with what he'd been indoctrinated into. And I have a list of sources on my website if anyone's interested, both about the Hitler Youth and also about the bombing of the city of Würzburg, both in German language books and then English accounts as well of people who survived the bombing in March 1945. And then a lot of it was just trying to find contemporaneous accounts. I have the Würzburg City Chronicle from 1946 that outlines in amazing detail everything that had happened in 1945, including how they dealt with all the bodies. And it just, I think just finding sources like that, all the way to finding like a 1939 railway map that let me know which routes were express and which ones weren't. It's, eBay's a wonderful thing if you're trying to track things down like that. So it was really just piecing all these things together and then letting all of that go, because in the end, for me, it was about the characters. And the only way I could write was just to let the characters lead me. And the research could almost become a distraction from that. So once I'd done what I needed to research-wise, I had to put all those books away, even though they were so interesting and I could feel their sort of siren song pulling me in. I sort of put them all aside and just let the characters walk me through the story.
And for me, it's the opposite, that I would come to a place where I needed the dailiness and I needed, and then I would go and I would read first-person accounts of some of it as well.
It's interesting.
And I also played the role of the novelist. Sometimes I imagine a lot.
And that's one part of the memoir that I think is so powerful, because I think you beautifully interweave the sort of investigative, the historical, and then your imagination, and also your own personal journey,
That's
dealing,
what I'm
sort of grappling with your own Jewish background. I think all those different threads interweave really beautifully into your story.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Sandell and Annette? Well, thank you both very much for being here tonight. This was really fabulous. I enjoyed your reading so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Laura.
Yeah. Thanks, Laura.
We put links in the chat to purchase a copy of Annette and Sandell's books via River Run. You get a 20% off discount, and there's also a link in there to both of their websites as well. Getting some thanks in the chat, which is nice. I will also add one more link again to our event feedback form. Please take the minute and fill it out. We love to hear what you think about library programs. And Sandell and Annette, do you have final thoughts?
Just thank you so much. And it's really a gift to be able to talk to you about your work, and to read to an audience. You know, this is my debut memoir. I never had the chance to really read at a bookshop, and this is the next best thing. And I'm just grateful for that, for the opportunity. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And, you know, as difficult as life is with the pandemic, I think a silver lining is that it does bring people together in such unexpected ways. And so, you know, I think I feel very lucky to have met Sandell on this sort of journey of putting our books out there, and also feel very grateful for all of you who join us and listen and sort of participate in our readings. So thank you very much.